Why did no secretary ever last more than a week with the billionaire CEO Emma Caldwell wasn't supposed to be different. She was broke, exhausted, and desperate when she walked into the glass tower of Harrington Enterprises, expecting nothing more than another job she'd probably lose. Instead, she walked straight into the path of Alexander Harrington, a man as ruthless as he was brilliant, a man whose assistants fled faster than rainwater down Manhattan streets. What happens when a woman with nothing left to lose collides with a man who's built walls no one can climb? Can honesty cut through arrogance? Can kindness disarm power? Or will love prove too fragile when tested against betrayal, ambition, and the ghosts of the past? This isn't just a story about romance, it's about resilience, about two people learning that happiness isn't found in perfection, but in choosing each other every single day, no matter the storms. So settle in, because what began as a job nobody wanted will turn into a journey neither of them could have imagined. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss a single chapter of this unforgettable story. Now, let's begin. Emma Caldwell sat in the lobby of a downtown employment agency, clutching a paper cup of lukewarm coffee like it was the last shred of dignity she owned. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow on the linoleum floor that had seen too many shoes, too many stories of people just like her, waiting, hoping, trying not to look desperate. Her phone buzzed. She checked the balance again, though she already knew the number by heart, 382.47. That was all she had left in her checking account. Rent was due in 9 days. Her mother's medical bills had piled into a neat stack on her kitchen counter, envelopes she couldn't bear to open. And the cupboards in her small apartment offered little more than peanut butter and half a loaf of bread. At 28, Emma thought she would have been somewhere else by now, maybe teaching high school English, maybe running a small bookstore like she used to dream. Instead, she was here, wearing a second-hand blazer that smelled faintly of mothballs, waiting for someone to hand her a lifeline. The receptionist finally called her name. Miss Caldwell. The counselor will see you now. Emma rose, smoothing the creases from her skirt, and followed the woman down a narrow hallway. The office smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale hope. Behind a metal desk sat a woman in her 50s with tight curls, large glasses, and a smile that was polite but not particularly warm. "Have a seat," the woman said, sliding a folder across the desk. "Your file shows solid work experience, administrative roles. A year as an executive assistant, some retail." Emma nodded. "Yes, but my last position ended when the company downsized." She left out the part where her supervisor had given her a 2-hour notice, leaving her scrambling for months. The counselor glanced at her screen. "Most of our listings right now are entry-level. Pay is hourly, not much above minimum wage." Emma's heart sank. She couldn't afford not much. She needed anything that would actually pay the bills. The woman hesitated, then leaned forward slightly. "There is another option. Unusual, but well compensated." Emma blinked. Unusual how the counselor slid a single-page job description across the desk. The salary printed at the bottom made Emma's eyes widen. It was more money than she had ever seen attached to a legitimate job offer, enough to pay her debts, cover her mother's treatments, and maybe even breathe for the first time in years. Her throat tightened. "This can't be real. What's the catch?" The woman pursed her lips. "The position is for Alexander Harrington. You've heard of him." Emma's stomach dropped. Of course she'd heard of him. Everyone had. Harrington Enterprises was practically a household name, a multi-billion-dollar empire in technology, logistics, and half a dozen other industries. And Alexander Harrington was its crown prince, a 34-year-old CEO who graced magazine covers as often for his ruthless business maneuvers as for his impossibly tailored suits. Emma remembered reading an article that described him as brilliant, demanding, and utterly merciless. She swallowed. What happened to the last assistant? The counselor's expression turned careful. "Well, Miss Caldwell, you would be the 36th in 3 years." Emma blinked. 35 assistants quit, not all quit. A few were dismissed. One had a nervous breakdown. Another simply vanished, never even collected her last paycheck. The average tenure is less than a week. The room was silent for a moment, except for the sound of Emma's coffee cup crinkling in her grip. She gave a shaky laugh. So, what you're saying, he's a tyrant. The woman looked uncomfortable. Let's just say Mr. Harrington has high standards. He works long hours, expects absolute precision, and has little patience for mistakes. Most people find the environment unbearable. Emma stared at the salary again. Enough to change her life. Enough to keep her mother's treatments going, maybe even get her out of the cycle of constant fear and debt. Her stomach rumbled, loud enough to make the counselor's eyebrows lift. Emma's cheeks flushed, but she forced herself to meet the woman's gaze. "When's the interview?" she asked softly. The counselor studied her a moment longer, as though weighing her resilience. Then she handed over a form with an address printed in bold letters. "Tomorrow morning, 9 sharp. And Miss Caldwell." "Yes. Good luck." The woman's voice was lower now, almost pitying. "You're going to need it." The next morning. Emma stood on the sidewalk outside a 50-story tower of glass and steel that gleamed against the pale New York sky. The building seemed less like an office and more like a fortress, shiny, unyielding, daring the world to challenge its authority. Her reflection stared back at her in the revolving doors. The thrift store blazer looked a little less threadbare in the morning light. Her auburn hair was pinned in a neat bun, and the only pair of shoes without holes pinched her feet with each step. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and whispered to herself, "It's just an interview. What's the worst that can happen?" But deep down, Emma Caldwell already knew that this interview was going to change everything. The security guard at the front desk barely looked up when Emma Caldwell gave her name. He scanned her driver's license, printed a temporary badge, and pointed toward the bank of elevators with the kind of detached efficiency that comes from watching nervous job applicants all day. 50th floor, he said, CEO's suite. Good luck. Those last 2 words again. Emma wondered how many people had walked into this building hearing the same phrase, only to leave broken and humiliated before the week was out. She swallowed hard, stepped into the gleaming elevator, and pressed the button marked 50. The doors slid shut, sealing her inside a mirrored box. She caught a glimpse of herself, pale face, tired eyes, hair pulled so tight it gave her a headache. She tried to smile, but the reflection that stared back at her looked unconvinced. The elevator ride was so smooth it felt unreal, like drifting upward without gravity. Her ears popped as the numbers climbed. By the time the doors opened, Emma's heart was beating fast enough to drown out everything else. The 50th floor looked nothing like the rest of the building. The lobby stretched wide, its marble floors gleaming beneath a chandelier that could have belonged in a European palace. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a panoramic view of Manhattan, where tiny yellow cabs crawled through the grid of streets far below. Every detail screamed wealth, power, and permanence. A woman in her 60s approached, poised and elegant, her gray hair swept into a smooth chignon. She wore pearls at her neck and carried a leather tablet with the same ease another woman might carry a teacup. "You must be Miss Caldwell," she said warmly. "I'm Margaret Hale, Mr. Harrington's senior assistant. He'll be with you shortly. But first, a few questions." Emma nodded, her throat dry. She followed Margaret into a smaller conference room where the walls were lined with abstract art, the kind that looked like brushstrokes of chaos, but probably cost more than Emma would make in a year. "Why do you want to work for Mr. Harrington?" Margaret asked. Emma hesitated. She could have said something about ambition, career growth, or building her future. But after everything she'd been through, after all the polite lies she'd told in other interviews, she found herself too tired for pretense. "I need the money," she said simply, "and I'm willing to work harder than anyone else to earn it." Margaret raised her eyebrows. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then she gave the faintest smile. Refreshing. Most people try to impress us with rehearsed speeches. Honesty may serve you well here. She glanced at her watch. One more question. Do you consider yourself resilient? Emma thought back to nights eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner, afternoons waiting for the pharmacy to refill her mother's prescriptions when her card declined, mornings waking up to eviction notices taped to the door. Yes, she said softly. I've had to be. Margaret studied her for another long moment, then gave a small nod. Very well. Let's see how you fare with Mr. Harrington himself. The office they entered next was larger than Emma's entire apartment. The far wall was nothing but glass. The city skyline spread like a map at Alexander Harrington's feet. A mahogany desk stood near the windows, flanked by bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes and models of architectural landmarks. And there he was. Alexander Harrington stood with his back to them, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a phone. His voice was sharp, measured, carrying a quiet authority that left no room for argument. I don't want excuses. Jonathan, he said, I want results. If the deal isn't finalized by Friday, I'll find someone who can make it happen. Am I clear? Emma felt the air shift when he ended the call. He turned slowly, and the first sight of him stole her breath. Photographs and magazines hadn't done justice to the impact of Alexander Harrington in person. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders under a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than Emma's rent for a year. His dark hair was slightly tousled, as though he'd run a hand through it in frustration, and his eyes, an arresting steel gray, were fixed on her with unnerving intensity. Emma's knees wobbled. She forced herself to stand straighter. Miss Caldwell, he said, his voice low, edged with something that could have been impatience or curiosity. Please, sit. She obeyed, perching on the edge of a leather chair that was far too comfortable for her trembling state. I'll be direct, Alexander continued. This position is not for the faint of heart. I work 16-hour days. I travel on short notice, and I have no tolerance for incompetence or delay. The last assistant lasted 4 days. Why should I believe you will be different? Emma drew a steady breath. It was now or never. Because I've already lost everything that can be taken from me, she said quietly. And when you've hit rock bottom, you learn you can endure almost anything. For a fraction of a second, something flickered in his expression. Not pity, he wasn't the type to pity anyone, but a spark of interest. Almost amusement? Go on, he said. I know I don't come from the same world you do, Emma continued, forcing her voice to remain steady. I'm not polished. I'm not from a powerful family. But I know how to work. I know how to survive. And I don't quit, no matter how hard it gets. If that's what you need in an assistant, then I'm the right person. The silence stretched so long that Emma thought she'd ruined everything. Then Alexander leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing as though cataloging every flaw, every weakness, and finding something he couldn't quite dismiss. At last, he spoke. You're hired. Provisional, of course. 3 months. If you survive that long, we'll discuss permanence. Emma exhaled so sharply she almost laughed. Relief flooded her chest, so fierce it hurt. Thank you, Mr. Harrington. I won't let you down. Alexander's mouth curved, not into a smile exactly, but into something sharper, more dangerous. Miss Caldwell, you already have. You arrived 2 minutes late. Don't let it happen again. Emma blinked. But the elevator. There are no excuses in this office, he said, cutting her off with a glance so sharp she felt it in her bones. If you want to last, you'll learn that quickly. Her relief wavered, but she lifted her chin. Understood. Good, Alexander said, turning back to the window, dismissing her as thoroughly as he had dismissed the skyline. Margaret will show you the ropes. You start now. Emma followed Margaret out, her head spinning. She had a job. She also had a boss who looked at her like a puzzle he intended to solve or break. Either way, she thought grimly, her life would never be the same. Emma Caldwell had imagined that her first day as Alexander Harrington's assistant might begin with orientation, maybe a stack of manuals, a quiet tour of the office, or at least a moment to breathe. Instead, she was handed a tablet, a folder thicker than a phone book, and a list of instructions that looked more like a military campaign than a daily schedule. Cancel his 2 o'clock lunch. Reschedule the meeting with Halberd Shipping for tomorrow morning. Prepare a summary of the international contracts on his desk. And, Margaret added with a sympathetic glance, he likes his coffee black. 160 degrees exactly. Emma blinked. How do I make sure it's exactly 160? Margaret gave a faint smile. You'll figure it out. And then she left her standing alone outside the glass-walled office of the most intimidating man she had ever met. Inside, Alexander was already on a call, pacing the length of the room like a caged panther. His voice cut through the air, low but edged with steel. I don't care if the board is nervous. Tell them we don't negotiate from weakness. If they want to walk, let them walk, but make sure they understand they'll regret it. He ended the call with a flick of his wrist and turned his gaze on Emma. You're still here? She swallowed. Yes. Mr. Harrington. Margaret said, Margaret isn't your boss. He gestured toward the desk piled with papers. I am. Can you type 80 words per minute, 75? She admitted, not good enough. Start with those contracts anyway. I want summaries on my desk in 1 hour. Clear, concise, no errors. If you miss the deadline, you're done. Emma opened her mouth, then closed it again. She thought of her dwindling bank account, her mother's prescriptions, and the shame of failing on her very first day. She nodded. Understood. The next 3 hours blurred into chaos. She spilled coffee on her blazer when the machine hissed unexpectedly. She fumbled with the internal phone system, accidentally hanging up on a vice president who barked insults down the line. She discovered that Alexander's filing system was less a system and more a labyrinth of folders labeled with cryptic shorthand only he understood. Every few minutes, his voice cut through her fog of panic. Miss Caldwell, confirm the 7 p.m. reservation at Delano. Miss Caldwell, where's the report on revenue margins? Miss Caldwell, when I say concise, I don't mean gut the information until it's useless. Try again. By the second hour, sweat beaded at her temples. By the third, her hands trembled as she typed, each keystroke echoing louder than the last in her ears. She thought of the other assistants, the ones who hadn't lasted. She could see them now, walking out of this building, with tears streaking their cheeks, muttering curses under their breath, swearing never to return. Am I next, she wondered. Am I strong enough to survive this? Her stomach churned. She wanted to run. But then she thought of her mother lying in that small hospital bed, tubes snaking from her arms, whispering, Don't give up, Em. You're tougher than you think. Emma straightened her back. She would not be another name on Alexander Harrington's long list of casualties. At 1:15, she placed the first stack of contract summaries on his desk. Her handwriting was neat, her notes precise. Alexander scanned the pages quickly. For a moment, she thought he would dismiss them with a scowl, but he only gave a curt nod. Adequate, adequate. It wasn't praise, but it wasn't failure either. Something in Emma's chest loosened just enough to breathe. By late afternoon, she had rescheduled 6 meetings, declined 4 press inquiries, and learned that Alexander's coffee had to be brewed, cooled, and reheated to hit the exact temperature he demanded. She nearly dropped the cup when she delivered it, but his eyes flicked to the digital thermometer she'd left beside it. 161 degrees, he noted. Close, close, again, not praise, again, not failure. At 5:30, when most offices in Manhattan began emptying, Emma glanced around at the bustling 50th floor. Phones still rang. Assistants hustled past with stacks of documents. And in the center of it all, Alexander Harrington sat behind his desk, calm amid the storm, his gray eyes scanning the world like a general charting a battlefield. Emma realized then this wasn't just a company. It was an empire. And he wasn't just a CEO. He was a man who demanded the impossible and got it. At 7:45, Margaret appeared with 2 cups of tea. She set one quietly on Emma's desk, then leaned down. "How are you holding up?" Emma gave a tired laugh. "I feel like I've been hit by a truck." "Good," Margaret said softly. "That means you survived your first day." Emma stared at her, then at the glowing lights of the city outside the glass walls. She had survived. Barely. And though every muscle ached, a spark of pride flickered inside her. She could do this. She had to. At 9 p.m., when Alexander finally dismissed her with a brief wave of his hand, Emma stepped into the elevator, her legs weak, but her spirit stubbornly intact. As the doors closed, she whispered under her breath, "I'll last more than a week. Watch me." Emma Caldwell had just finished updating the next week's calendar when Alexander's voice cut through the intercom, low and commanding as ever. "Miss Caldwell, my office. Now." Her heart sank. Every summons from him felt like standing before a firing squad. She smoothed the wrinkles from her blouse and walked into his office, where he was standing with his hands behind his back, gazing out the window at the city glittering below. Without turning, he said, "Pack a bag. We leave for Chicago at dawn." Emma froze. Chicago. He finally turned, gray eyes narrowing. "Yes, I assume you've heard of it. I have negotiations with Sterling Aeronautics. You'll accompany me." She blinked. Mr. Harrington. I've only been here 3 days. I don't even—" "Precisely," he interrupted. "Time to see if you can manage the pace. Margaret will give you the briefing documents. 4:30 sharp. Don't be late." And just like that, he dismissed her, turning back to the skyline as if the conversation had already ended. Emma walked out, her pulse racing. Chicago, a private jet, executives who would laugh if she stumbled over a single note. She wanted to say no, but she knew she couldn't afford to. "Am I strong enough for this?" she wondered, clutching the folder Margaret handed her. The next morning came like a slap. Emma barely slept. She arrived at the Harrington Enterprises Tower with her thrift store suitcase and a cup of gas station coffee, only to find Alexander already waiting by the car, immaculate in a tailored navy suit, not a hair out of place. "You're late," he said, checking his watch. "It's 4:28. Emma protested. 2 minutes is still late." His tone was flat, but she caught the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth, as though her indignation amused him. They rode in silence to the private airstrip, where a sleek jet waited, its silver surface gleaming in the early light. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of leather and cedar. Emma sank into a seat that was more comfortable than her bed at home, feeling out of place in her modest blazer. Alexander took the seat across from her, already scrolling through documents on his tablet. For several minutes, the only sounds were the hum of the engines and the rustle of paper. Finally, he spoke without looking up. First rule: never apologize for being unprepared. It makes you look weaker than the mistake itself. Emma bristled. "Who said I was unprepared?" He glanced up, his gray eyes sharp. "Your face." Heat rose in her cheeks. She opened her folder and buried herself in the briefing notes, determined not to give him the satisfaction of seeing her flustered. Half an hour into the flight, a flight attendant appeared with trays of breakfast perfectly sliced fruit, croissants that looked like they came from a Parisian bakery, steaming cups of dark coffee. She placed one tray in front of Alexander and one in front of Emma. Emma's stomach growled, betraying her. She hadn't had time for more than a bite of a granola bar before rushing out the door. Alexander's eyes flicked to her. "When did you last eat?" She hesitated. "I'm fine. That wasn't my question." Emma bit her lip. "Yesterday evening?" His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Without another word, he slid his plate of fruit toward her. She blinked. "What are you—" "Eat. You'll be useless to me if you faint halfway through the meeting." "I couldn't, Miss Caldwell." His tone softened just slightly, though his eyes still held command. "That wasn't a request." Emma hesitated, then picked up a slice of melon. The sweetness hit her tongue like sunlight after a storm. She tried to eat delicately, but hunger betrayed her. When she glanced up, Alexander was watching, not with judgment, but with a kind of detached curiosity, as though she were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. She blurted, "Why are you being—" Kind, one eyebrow arched. Kind ensuring my assistant doesn't collapse from hunger is pragmatism, not kindness. But something in the way he said it too fast, too defensive made Emma wonder. Later, as turbulence rocked the plane, Emma gripped the armrest until her knuckles whitened. She hated flying, though she had tried to hide it. Alexander's gaze flicked to her hand. Without thinking, he reached across the small table, steadying her wrist with a firm grip. The warmth of his skin startled her more than the bump of the plane. "Breathe," he said quietly. For a moment, the storm outside vanished. There was only his hand grounding her, his voice steady in the chaos. Then he released her abruptly, leaning back as though the contact had burned him. "You'll need to do better than this if you want to keep up," he said, back to his cold tone. But Emma saw at the flicker in his eyes, the crack in his armor. Behind the ruthless exterior, there was something else. Loneliness, maybe, or exhaustion. She leaned back, her heart still racing. For the first time, she wondered what it cost him to live this way, always commanding, always feared, never trusting anyone long enough to let them close. And she wondered, just for a fleeting second, if she was meant to change that. Emma had expected paperwork, endless scheduling, and perhaps another exhausting trip. What she had not expected was to find herself standing in front of a gilt-edged mirror in a borrowed evening gown, staring at a version of herself she barely recognized. The gown, midnight blue silk, fitted but modest, had arrived that morning with a note in Margaret's neat handwriting. "Mr. Harrington requires your presence at tonight's charity gala. Black tie attire enclosed. 7 p.m. sharp." Emma had read the note 3 times, hoping it meant something else. But no, when she asked Margaret, the older woman simply gave her a wry smile. "Consider it part of the job, dear." So here she was, hair swept into a loose chignon, clutching a pair of heels that felt more like medieval torture devices than footwear, preparing to walk into a ballroom full of New York's elite. The car ride was silent. Alexander sat beside her. Crisp tuxedo perfect, cufflinks gleaming in the dim interior light. He looked every inch the untouchable mogul, his jaw set in its usual firm line. Finally, Emma broke the silence. "I don't understand why I'm here. Surely you could hire someone more experienced." Alexander's gaze flicked to her. Unreadable. "I don't hire escorts. Miss Caldwell, I need someone at my side who won't embarrass me." Emma bristled, comforting. He almost smiled, though it was gone before she could be sure. "You'll manage." The Waldorf's ballroom glittered like something out of a dream. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in golden light. Waiters glided past with trays of champagne. Women in gowns that sparkled like starlight clung to men in tailored suits, each couple vying for attention. As they entered, Alexander placed his hand lightly on Emma's back, guiding her forward. The touch sent a jolt through her, though his expression remained all business. "Remember," he murmured, "we've known each other 3 months. You admire my work. You find me charming. Try to look smitten, Miss Caldwell. It shouldn't be too difficult." She shot him a glare. "You're insufferable." But when a group of board members approached, Emma forced a smile, nodding politely as Alexander introduced her as a close companion. The men exchanged knowing glances. The women whispered behind jeweled fingers. Emma's cheeks burned, but she held her ground, remembering her mother's voice. "Hold your head high, no matter what room you're in." Dinner passed in a blur of clinking glasses and shallow conversation. Emma sat quietly, occasionally answering polite questions, more often just listening. But she couldn't help noticing how Alexander moved through the crowd. He was sharp, commanding, yet never rude. People leaned in when he spoke, desperate for his approval. He wielded charm like a weapon, controlled, precise, devastating. And then, during a lull between speeches, He leaned toward her. "You're doing better than most of your predecessors," he said quietly. Emma blinked. "You mean they couldn't sit at a table without choking?" He smirked faintly. "One fainted. Another left mid-dinner, claiming food poisoning. You, at least, are still upright." It was the closest thing to a compliment she had ever received from him, and for reasons she couldn't explain, it warmed her. Later, when the orchestra struck up a slow waltz, Alexander rose smoothly and extended his hand. "Dance with me?" he said. Emma froze. Do you intend to make me look like a man who can't find a partner?" His tone was mild, but his eyes held a challenge. Reluctantly, she placed her hand in his. His palm was warm, steady. He guided her onto the floor with a grace that made her wonder how many lessons he had endured in his youth. As they moved together, Emma felt her nerves settle. His hand rested at her waist, firm but not possessive. His eyes, gray and sharp, softened just slightly in the glow of the chandeliers. "You're nervous," he murmured. "Wouldn't you be?" she whispered back. "I never am." She looked up at him, meeting his gaze. "Then maybe that's your problem." For a heartbeat. Silence stretched between them, and then, unexpectedly, Alexander laughed a low, genuine sound that startled her as much as it warmed her. The edges of his mask slipped. Just for a moment, she glimpsed something real. The moment didn't last. A flash went off from the side of the dance floor. Emma turned her head to see a photographer lowering his camera, eyes gleaming with triumph. Alexander muttered a curse under his breath, tightening his grip on her hand as he led her off the floor. "What just happened?" Emma whispered. "Congratulations, Miss Caldwell," he said grimly. "You've just become tomorrow's headline." He was right. The next morning, Emma stopped at a corner deli for coffee, only to freeze at the stack of newspapers near the register. On the front page, beneath the bold headline, "Billionaire Alexander Harrington's Mystery Date," was a photo of her and Alexander on the dance floor, his hand at her waist, her eyes lifted toward his, both of them captured in a moment that looked less like business and more like a love story. Emma's heart pounded. She grabbed a copy, her hands trembling. The caption beneath the photo read, "The notoriously private mogul seems captivated by his elegant companion. Is Alexander Harrington finally tamed elegant companion?" She almost laughed. If only they knew the truth that she was just an assistant, a woman desperate enough to take a job no one else could endure. But looking at the photo, even Emma had to admit, they didn't look like boss and employee. They looked like something far more dangerous. Emma Caldwell had never thought her face would end up on the front page of a newspaper. She had grown up invisible, one of countless young women struggling to make ends meet in a small Ohio town. And yet now, staring down at the New York Post in the corner deli, she saw herself caught mid-waltz in the arms of Alexander Harrington. The headline screamed, "Billionaire CEO's mystery woman who has captured Harrington's heart." Emma felt her knees weaken. Her hand trembled as she set the paper back on the stack, as if touching it might burn her. By the time she reached the office, the whispers had already started. Assistants in pencil skirts huddled in the hallway, their voices dropping when she walked past. A young man in accounting actually whistled softly before his manager elbowed him into silence. Emma kept her chin high, though inside her stomach was twisting into knots. Margaret intercepted her before she reached her desk. The older woman carried 2 cups of coffee, and a look that combined sympathy with resignation. "You've seen it," Margaret asked gently. Emma managed a nod. "It's everywhere," Margaret continued, her voice low. 3 magazines want exclusive interviews. TMZ has a crew outside the building, and Victoria Society Weekly. She rolled her eyes, has already speculated on what your wedding dress might look like. Emma nearly choked on her coffee. "Wedding dress. Don't panic," Margaret said quickly. "These things flare up fast and burn out. The trouble is, Mr. Harrington doesn't exactly handle publicity well when it concerns his private life." As if on cue, the intercom buzzed. Alexander's voice, clipped and cold. "Miss Caldwell, my office, now." Emma entered his office like a woman walking into a storm. Newspapers were strewn across his desk. His laptop screen displayed a dozen gossip sites, each splashed with her face beside his. He stood rigid behind the desk, fists clenched, gray eyes burning with fury. "Care to explain this?" he demanded, holding up the Post. Emma's jaw dropped. "Explain? I didn't hire a photographer to follow us onto the dance floor." His eyes narrowed, but she saw something else flickering beneath the anger worry. "You should have been more careful," he muttered. "Do you have any idea what this means? Reporters have been calling my mother. They've been camped outside my building since dawn. And now," he dropped the paper onto the desk with a thud. "Now they'll come after you." Emma froze. "Me? They'll dig," he said darkly, "into your past, your family, your finances. They'll twist every detail into a headline. Are you ready for that?" Her throat went dry. "Of course not. I never asked for this." His voice softened by a fraction. "I know." For a long moment, silence stretched between them. Alexander rubbed the bridge of his nose, suddenly looking more exhausted than furious. "I should never have asked you to attend that gala," he admitted. "It was reckless." Emma blinked. It was the closest thing to an apology she had ever heard from him. "I can handle gossip," Alexander continued, "but I won't allow you to be collateral damage in my war with the press. If they cross a line, I'll bury them in lawsuits." The raw protectiveness in his tone startled her. "You're worried about me?" she said quietly. He looked up, meeting her gaze. "Of course I am." Her chest tightened. For all his sharp edges, Alexander Harrington was not indifferent, not when it came to her. By midday, the office buzzed like a hornet's nest. Emma's inbox overflowed with inquiries, invitations to talk shows, requests for comments, even a VIP couples retreat promotion from a luxury resort in the Bahamas. Margaret intercepted most of them, shielding Emma as best she could, but the pressure was relentless. During lunch, Emma slipped into the ladies' room just to breathe. She splashed cold water on her face, staring at her reflection. "This isn't me," she whispered. "I'm not built for this spotlight." But another voice rose inside her, the same one that had carried her through sleepless nights and impossible days. "You're stronger than you think. Don't let them decide who you are." That evening, as she prepared to leave, Alexander appeared beside her desk without warning. He didn't speak until the elevator doors closed and they were alone, descending in silence. Finally, he said, "I've arranged security for you." Emma's head snapped toward him. "Security." He nodded. 2 men, discreet but effective. "You'll see them tomorrow." She stared at him, caught between outrage and disbelief. "You think I need bodyguards? I know you do," he said firmly. "Don't argue." Emma folded her arms. "You can't just miss Caldwell," he cut in, his voice low but fierce. "I may tolerate reporters prying into my life, but if they lay a finger on you, they'll regret it. I won't take that risk." The elevator dinged and the doors slid open. He stepped out first, shoulders squared, every inch the untouchable mogul again. But Emma lingered for a second, her heart pounding, because for the first time, she realized beneath his fury at the world, Alexander Harrington was afraid, not of losing control of his empire, but of losing her. The first time Emma heard the name Catherine Ashford was not from Alexander, not even from Margaret. It was from the television in a cafe near the office. Emma had ducked in for a quick sandwich, hoping to avoid the stares she'd been getting all week. On the mounted screen above the counter, a polished news anchor announced speculation continues around Alexander Harrington's mystery companion. Today, Catherine Ashford. Former fiancée of the Billionaire CEO spoke publicly for the first time. Emma froze, the sandwich forgotten in her hands. The screen shifted to footage of a stunning blonde woman in a pearl-white suit, standing before a cluster of microphones. Her voice was smooth as silk, every word calculated. I can't pretend it doesn't sting to see Alexander so suddenly attached, Catherine said, tilting her head just so, her diamond earrings flashing in the light. But I do worry. Alexander has always been vulnerable to the wrong people. I just hope this young woman isn't taking advantage of his good heart. The reporters chuckled. One shouted, "Are you suggesting she's after his money?" Catherine's smile was cool, practiced. I wouldn't dream of making such accusations. But I will say, Alexander deserves someone who understands the demands of his world, someone of equal standing. Anything less is doomed to fail. Emma's stomach twisted. She left the cafe before her sandwich was even wrapped. That evening, she found Margaret waiting by her desk, arms folded. "You've seen the footage." Emma nodded. "Who is she, really?" Margaret sighed, lowering her voice. "Catherine Ashford, daughter of the Whitmore banking family. She and Alexander were engaged 5 years ago. 3 days before the wedding, she broke it off, chose a man with a bigger name, more established pedigree." Emma's chest tightened. "And now, she's back." Margaret's eyes softened. "She smells blood in the water. The press loves a triangle, and Catherine loves the spotlight." Emma didn't have long to dwell. When Alexander summoned her into his office the next morning, the tension in the air was palpable. He stood at the window, hands clasped behind his back, staring at the skyline as though it had betrayed him. "She spoke to the press," he said flatly, not turning. Emma hesitated. "I saw." Finally, he turned. His expression was carved from stone, but something darker swirled in his gray eyes. "She's painting you as an opportunist," he said, "and the press is lapping it up. They're calling you a distraction, a liability." Emma's throat tightened. "Do you believe them?" His eyes flickered just enough to betray the war inside him. "No," he said at last, though his voice lacked conviction. "But this is exactly what Catherine does. She undermines, she poisons, and she always gets what she wants." Emma wanted to reach for him, to say, "I'm not her. I won't hurt you." But the wall around him had already started to rise. Over the next few days, Catherine's shadow spread. Paparazzi staked out Emma's apartment building, shouting questions about her childhood, her parents, her debts. Tabloids ran side-by-side photos of Catherine in couture gowns and Emma in thrift store suits, sneering at the inequality. One headline read, "From Secretary to Cinderella, but how long? Until midnight strikes." Emma tried to ignore it, but each article chipped away at her resolve. In the office, Alexander grew colder, not cruel, never that, but distant. He buried himself in work, dismissing her with curt nods, avoiding the easy banter that had started to creep in before Catherine's return. One evening, as they reviewed contracts in his office, Emma gathered her courage. "Do you want me to quit?" she asked quietly. His pen froze. Slowly. He lifted his gaze to hers. "What if my presence is damaging you? If I'm a liability?" The word tasted bitter on her tongue. "Say the word, and I'll go." For a moment, something raw flashed across his face, fear, anger, longing all tangled together. Then the mask slid back into place. "No," he said sharply. "You're not leaving." Her heart fluttered, but his next words cut deeper. "But don't mistake this for anything more than professional necessity. Catherine is waiting for me to show weakness. I won't give her the satisfaction." Emma nodded, swallowing hard. Professional necessity. That was all. Later that night, after everyone else had gone home, Alexander sat alone in his office. The city lights glittered below, but he didn't see them. He saw Catherine's smile, sharp as glass. He heard her words, dripping with poison, and worst of all, he felt the old wound reopening, the humiliation of being abandoned, the sting of realizing he had never been enough for her world. He poured himself a glass of scotch, staring at his reflection in the window. "Don't be a fool again," he told himself. "Don't trust, don't feel, don't let her or anyone inside." But as he closed his eyes, the image that surfaced wasn't Catherine's. It was Emma's, her tired smile, her trembling hand steadying his coffee. the fire in her voice when she said she wouldn't quit, and that scared him most of all. The office had grown quieter since Catherine Ashford's return to the headlines. Meetings were still relentless, phone calls still endless, but beneath the surface, something had shifted. Emma felt it in the way Alexander moved tense, guarded, as though every step risked reopening an old wound. He no longer lingered in conversation with her, no longer allowed their banter to soften the edges of his days. Instead, he threw himself into work with a ferocity that left no room for air. And Emma, sitting just beyond his glass walls, felt the chill creeping in. One evening, long after most of the staff had gone home, Emma found herself still at her desk, sorting through contracts. Her back ached, her eyes burned, but she pressed on. She refused to give Catherine the satisfaction of seeing her crack. The door to Alexander's office opened, and he stepped out, jacket off, tie loosened. For a moment, she saw not the CEO, but a man weary to his bones. "You should go home," he said, voice low. "So should you," Emma countered gently. His lips twitched, almost a smile, but then his gaze hardened. Don't try to soften this." Emma frowned. "Soften what he exhaled, rubbing his temple. You think this, whatever this is between us, means something, but it doesn't. It can't." The words hit her like a slap. "Alexander." He cut her off, his voice sharper now. "Catherine was right about one thing. My world demands sacrifices. Attachments make you weak, and weakness destroys everything." Emma rose slowly, her hands trembling but her spine straight. "You think caring about someone makes you weak? No, Alexander, it makes you human." His eyes flashed, storm gray and burning. This was a mistake. The silence that followed was louder than any shouting match. Emma's chest ached, but she refused to let him see her break. She lifted her chin, her voice steady, though her heart was crumbling. "You may convince yourself of that, but I know better. I've seen you when you're not hiding behind that armor. I've seen kindness, even if you can't admit it. And I won't let Catherine or your past decide who you are now." He looked at her as if torn in two. For a fraction of a second, she thought he might reach for her. But then the wall slammed back into place. "Go home, Miss Caldwell." His tone was final, cold, unyielding. Emma held his gaze a moment longer, then nodded once. "As you wish, Mr. Harrington." And she walked out, heels clicking against the marble floor, dignity intact, though her heart bled with every step. Outside, the night air bit at her skin. She wrapped her coat tighter, breathing hard. She could leave. She could quit tomorrow, find another job, escape the glare of reporters and the shadow of Catherine's smirk. She could spare herself the pain of fighting for a man too afraid to fight for himself. But deep down, she knew she wouldn't. Because behind all his coldness, Alexander Harrington was not the ruthless caricature the tabloids painted. He was a man scarred, abandoned, and afraid. And Emma stubborn, resilient. Emma was not about to let fear win. "I won't quit," she vowed silently. "Not on him, not on myself." Back in his office, Alexander poured a glass of scotch and sank into the leather chair. His hands shook as he lifted it. He hated himself for the words he'd spoken, for the look on Emma's face when he pushed her away. But the alternative terrified him more. Catherine's betrayal had gutted him once. Loving her had nearly cost him everything: his pride, his trust, his sense of worth. He had sworn never again. And yet, Emma, with her steady gaze, her quiet strength, her refusal to bend. Emma, who had walked into his world with nothing and somehow refused to be consumed by it. He took a long swallow of scotch, the burn a poor match for the fire in his chest. "This is safer," he muttered to the empty room. "For her, for me." But even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. That night, Emma lay awake in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling. Her phone buzzed again and again with new headlines, cruel speculation, photos comparing her thrift store wardrobe to Catherine's designer gowns. She closed her eyes, letting the tears slip silently down her cheeks. Then she whispered into the darkness, I'm stronger than this. Stronger than you think. Alexander Harrington. One day, you'll see. The cafe on Fifth Avenue glittered with chandeliers and hushed conversation. Everything about it screamed exclusivity, polished marble floors, velvet chairs, waiters who moved like dancers in a silent performance. It wasn't Emma's world, and Catherine Ashford knew it. Emma arrived on time, her modest navy dress pressed neatly, hair tied back. She'd chosen this cafe herself, not because she belonged there, but because she refused to let Catherine dictate the battlefield. When she walked in, heads turned, not because she was famous, but because people were curious. Is that her? The woman with Alexander Harrington. At a corner table, Catherine was already waiting. Perfect blonde waves framed her flawless face, a diamond bracelet glittering on her wrist. She didn't rise. She merely smirked, her latte untouched, her posture radiating entitlement. Emma, she drawled, as though tasting the name for the first time. How quaint. Emma slid into the chair opposite her, spine straight. Catherine. The silence stretched, broken only by the clink of porcelain and the low hum of wealthy patrons discussing stocks and vacations in the Hamptons. Finally, Catherine leaned forward, her voice soft but edged with venom. You must be enjoying yourself. The papers, the attention, Alexander's, protection. She let the last word linger, as if implying something sordid. Emma folded her hands calmly. I'm just doing my job. Catherine laughed, a sharp, cold sound. Job? Darling, you're not his assistant anymore. You're his charity case, a project, something to keep him entertained until he grows bored. Don't mistake survival for significance. Emma's pulse quickened, but she kept her expression steady. If that's what you believe, why invite me here? Catherine's eyes gleamed. Because I want to give you a chance to walk away with dignity. End this farce before you become nothing more than a headline footnote. The assistant who thought she mattered. Emma inhaled slowly, steadying herself. You really think you can decide who deserves to stand beside him? Of course, Catherine replied smoothly. I know his world. I know the demands, the expectations, the circles he must move in. He needs someone who reflects his status. Not, her gaze swept over Emma like a scalpel. Someone from Ohio with a waitress mother and a resume of odd jobs. The words stung because they were true, but truth wasn't weakness, not anymore. Emma leaned forward, her voice calm but strong. You're right, I don't come from wealth. I don't have a trust fund or a family name that opens doors. My mother worked double shifts to keep the lights on. I put myself through school one night, class at a time. I've failed, scraped by, and stood in line at food banks. So, yes, Catherine, I am ordinary. But ordinary doesn't mean worthless. Catherine blinked, clearly not expecting defiance. I may be nobody to you, Emma continued, but I won't be bullied into silence. Not by you, not by the press, not by anyone who thinks money makes them better. Because the truth, Alexander doesn't need another mirror of his wealth. He needs someone who sees him as a man, not as a title or a bank account. And I can do that. Her voice wavered for only a second before she steadied it. So, if you think I'll walk away just because you sneer at my past, you've underestimated me. I'm not going anywhere. For the first time, Catherine's mask slipped. A flash of irritation darkened her perfect features. She set her cup down too hard, the porcelain rattling against the saucer. You're naive, Catherine hissed. Do you really think love is enough to survive in his world? That stubbornness will shield you from the scrutiny, the ridicule, the expectations. They will tear you apart. Emma met her glare evenly. Maybe, but at least I'll be torn apart on my own terms, not by bowing to someone else's bitterness. A shadow of something anger. Maybe fear crossed Catherine's face before she smoothed it back into practiced indifference. She leaned back, a cruel smile curling her lips. Very well. Stay in the game if you want. But mark my words. Emma, you won't last. And when you fall, don't expect Alexander to catch you. He's too much like me. Emma rose, slipping her bag over her shoulder. No, he's nothing like you. And maybe one day, he'll finally believe that himself. She left without looking back, her heart pounding, her legs shaky but her spirit unbroken. Outside, the chill air of Manhattan wrapped around her. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Every part of her wanted to collapse, to cry, to give in to the sting of Catherine's words. But instead, she straightened her shoulders. "I'm still here," she whispered, "and I'm not giving up." For the first time since Catherine had reappeared, Emma felt the faint stirrings of victory not in conquering Alexander's world, but in refusing to let it conquer her. Back inside, Catherine watched Emma leave, her nails digging into her palm. She had expected tears, capitulation, defeat. What she got instead was defiance, and that unsettled her more than she would ever admit. The boardroom of Harrington Enterprises was a place designed to inspire awe. A vast mahogany table stretched the length of the room, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that framed Manhattan's skyline like a crown. For years, Alexander Harrington had commanded this space with unshakable authority. His word was law, his vision unquestioned, but this morning, the air felt poisoned. 12 board members sat stiffly in their seats, their folders aligned, their faces carved in disapproval. At the head of the table, Alexander leaned back in his chair, mask of composure barely concealing the exhaustion in his eyes. On the far side, Catherine Ashford sat like a queen in exile returned to claim her throne. Her red lips curved into a smirk that promised blood. The chairman, an older man with thinning hair and an expensive watch, cleared his throat. "Mr. Harrington, concerns have been raised regarding your recent behavior." Alexander's voice was sharp. "Behavior? You mean profitability, because last quarter's numbers were the strongest in 5 years." Another board member, a woman with pearl earrings, shook her head. "This isn't about numbers. It's about judgment. The press has been relentless. Your public entanglement with your assistant has made you a liability." Catherine's eyes glittered. She didn't need to speak. Others would do her bidding. "You've been impulsive," the chairman continued. "Erratic. The headlines are a circus, and investors are spooked. Several have already threatened to pull their funding unless we take action." Alexander's jaw tightened. He had expected whispers, not an ambush. "And what action do you propose?" he asked coolly. The chairman exchanged glances with the others. "We believe it is in the best interest of Harrington Enterprises that you step aside. Temporarily, of course, until stability can be restored." For a moment, silence reigned. Alexander felt the words slam into him like blows. Step aside. Temporarily. Everyone knew what that meant. Once stripped of power, he'd never regain it. The empire he had built from nothing, the legacy he had carved with sleepless nights and ruthless precision, would be torn from his hands, and all because of a woman. No, because of love. Emma's face flashed in his mind, her quiet strength, her refusal to bend before Catherine's cruelty. The way she had looked at him like he was more than a CEO, more than a machine. For the first time, someone had seen him, and now she was being dragged into his chaos. "Convenient, isn't it?" Alexander said at last, his voice like ice. He turned his gaze on Catherine. "The moment she returns, suddenly the board questions my leadership. Suddenly whispers of instability flood the papers. Tell me, Catherine, how much of this circus have you orchestrated?" She tilted her head, feigning innocence. "Oh, Alexander, must you always assume the worst of me? The world sees what it sees. I simply illuminate the truth." His fist clenched beneath the table. She was lying, of course. He could almost smell the trail of her manipulation. The reporters conveniently tipped off, the investors suddenly nervous, the carefully timed rumors it was all her handiwork. But what choice did he have? Fight back and risk dragging Emma deeper into the firestorm, or surrender and lose everything he had worked for? The board murmured among themselves. their verdict nearly sealed. The chairman leaned forward. "Mr. Harrington, we need your decision. Will you cooperate in this transition, or force us to act formally?" Alexander closed his eyes briefly, fighting a wave of exhaustion that went bone deep. For the first time in his career, he felt cornered not by rivals, but by himself. He had always prided himself on control, on bending the world to his will. But control had slipped through his fingers the moment Emma Caldwell had walked into his office with those steady eyes and quiet defiance. And the cruel truth was this: he would burn down his empire before he let it consume her. He stood, tall and imposing, though his voice carried a raw edge rarely heard. "If stepping aside will protect this company and those I care about, then so be it. Consider this my resignation." Gasps echoed around the table. Catherine's smile widened, victory shining in her eyes. The chairman blinked. You're certain?" "Yes," Alexander said, though the word tasted like ash. "Effective immediately." Outside the boardroom, his steps echoed like gunshots in the marble hallway. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of defeat pressing down on his shoulders. Helena, his senior aide, hurried to catch up, her expression stricken. "Alexander, what did you just do?" He didn't stop walking. "What had to be done? You can't mean I won't let Emma be destroyed because of me." He snapped, then softened. "If I have to lose everything to keep her safe, then I'll do it." Helena stopped, watching him disappear down the corridor. For years, she had seen him fight, claw, and win battles no one thought possible. But this wasn't the Alexander Harrington she knew. This was a man broken not by failure, but by love. That night, Alexander sat alone in his penthouse, glass of whiskey untouched in his hand. The city glittered beyond the windows, indifferent to his downfall. He had given up his throne, but the ache in his chest told him it wasn't just the company he'd lost. It was Emma. He whispered into the silence, voice ragged. Maybe Catherine was right. Maybe I was a fool to believe I could have both power and love. Maybe this was always destined to collapse. The whiskey burned as he finally swallowed, but it was nothing compared to the fire in his chest. The boardroom buzzed like a nest of hornets. Men in suits whispered behind raised hands, papers shuffled with nervous urgency, and the air felt heavy with anticipation. At the head of the table sat Alexander Harrington, no longer the unshakable titan, but a man who had just resigned his crown. His shoulders were squared, but his eyes betrayed the weight of surrender. And then the doors opened. Every head turned as Emma Caldwell stepped inside. She wore a simple charcoal dress, her hair pinned neatly back, but there was nothing simple about the fire in her eyes. She wasn't supposed to be here. She had no seat at this table, no title, no authority. Yet her presence silenced the room more effectively than any gavel. "Miss Caldwell," the chairman said, startled. "This is a closed session." "Then consider this an interruption worth hearing," Emma replied, her voice steady though her hands trembled at her sides. She walked forward, each step echoing against the marble floor. She stopped beside Alexander, whose expression flickered from shock to concern. "Emma," he murmured under his breath. "You shouldn't." "I should," she interrupted gently but firmly. "You're not fighting for yourself. So, I will." Gasps rippled through the room. Catherine Ashford's lips curved in a mocking smile, already savoring the spectacle. Emma turned to face the board. Her heart pounded, but her voice carried, strong and unwavering. "You sit here questioning Alexander Harrington's fitness to lead. You call him impulsive, unstable, distracted. But let me tell you what I've seen." She drew a breath, summoning every ounce of courage. "I've seen a man who works 16-hour days, not because he's obsessed with power, but because he refuses to let a single person in this company down. I've seen him remember the names of security guards' children, send flowers when an employee's spouse was in the hospital, and write checks to charities he never allowed the press to discover. Yes, he's sharp. Yes, he's demanding. But he is also loyal, compassionate, human. That's what you're mistaking for weakness." The room was silent. Even Catherine shifted slightly, her confidence faltering. Emma's eyes swept the table. You want stability profit margins. He's delivered them all, and yet the moment he dares to be more than a machine, the moment he allows himself to care about someone, you call him unfit. Tell me, do you want a robot to run this company, or a leader who knows what it means to fight for something greater than numbers? Alexander stared at her, thunderstruck. He had expected tears, anger, maybe even silence. Not this. Not Emma standing before the most powerful people in his world, dismantling their accusations one truth at a time. Miss Caldwell, one board member began, his voice uncertain. Your personal involvement clouds your perspective. You're right, Emma cut in, surprising even herself with the steel in her tone. My perspective is personal, because I love him. The words rang through the room like a bell. Gasps erupted. Whispers shot across the table like sparks. Emma didn't flinch. Yes, I love him. Not the CEO, not the billionaire. I love the man who offered me breakfast on a plane when I hadn't eaten in days. I love the man who apologizes when his temper gets the best of him, who carries the weight of an empire on his shoulders but still finds a way to care about the smallest details. You say he's distracted. He's more focused than ever. You say he's unstable. He's steadier than any of you, because he's willing to risk everything, not for greed, not for vanity, but for love. The silence that followed was electric. Emma's chest rose and fell as though she had run a marathon. She had just laid her heart bare in front of the very people who could destroy both of them, but there was no taking it back. Finally, she turned to Alexander, her voice soft but clear enough for all to hear. And if loving him disqualifies me from being part of this world, then so be it. I'm not ashamed. I never will be. Catherine slammed her hand against the table, her composure cracking. This is absurd. You're letting a lovesick girl manipulate you with fairy tales. This company needs a leader, not a soap opera. Emma faced her without blinking. And yet, here you are back in this room, not because you care about the company, but because you can't stand to see Alexander move on without you. That's not leadership. Catherine, that's bitterness. Murmurs erupted, some in agreement, others in shock. The chairman cleared his throat, visibly shaken. This is highly irregular. He looked at Alexander. Mr. Harrington, do you have a response? Alexander rose slowly, his green eyes locked on Emma. For a long moment, he said nothing, as though searching for the words that had eluded him for years. Finally, his voice emerged, low but firm. My response is this. I've spent my life building walls so high that no one could ever scale them. I told myself it was strength, when really, it was fear. But Emma Caldwell saw through the walls. And she didn't just climb them, she tore them down. If that makes me unfit to lead, then I don't want your approval. But if you want a leader who is human, who is willing to stand in the fire and fight for what matters most, then I am still that man, and I always will be. The board fell into stunned silence. Catherine's face was pale with fury, her hands gripping the table so tightly her knuckles whitened. Emma stood beside Alexander, her hand brushing his, not quite touching, but enough to anchor him, enough to tell him he wasn't alone anymore. For the first time in years, Alexander Harrington wasn't standing above everyone else. He was standing with someone because of someone, and together, they were unbreakable. The boardroom slowly emptied, the heavy doors closing one by one until silence fell like a curtain. The city lights flickered through the tall windows, casting Alexander and Emma in a wash of gold and shadow. For years, this room had been his battlefield where he conquered, where he dictated, where he proved himself untouchable. Tonight, it felt more like a confessional. Alexander stood motionless at the head of the table, his hands braced against the polished wood. Emma hovered a few steps away, unsure if she should move closer or give him space. At last, he spoke, his voice low, rough around the edges. You shouldn't have done that. Emma straightened, heart hammering. You mean speaking up? Yes. He lifted his head, eyes gleaming with something she rarely saw. Fear? You walked into fire for me. Emma, do you know what that means? What it costs? I know exactly what it means, she said softly. It means you're not alone. He let out a bitter laugh, the sound echoing in the cavernous room. Not alone? God, I've spent my entire life making sure I was alone. It was safer that way. No weakness, no vulnerabilities, no one to take from me what they took before. Emma tilted her head. Catherine. His jaw tightened. Not just Catherine, everyone, investors, rivals, so-called friends. I trusted, I opened up, and each time it was used against me. So I learned build walls high enough, deep enough, and no one can hurt you. He turned away, staring out at Manhattan like the city itself might answer him. But then you walked into my office, this desperate woman with fire in her eyes, and suddenly the walls weren't enough. You didn't climb them, Emma. You dismantled them, piece by piece. Emma swallowed hard. Is that a bad thing? He spun back to face her, the anguish in his expression startling. Yes, because now I'm terrified. Do you understand? I am Alexander Harrington. I can bend markets, crush competitors, control empires. But I can't control this. He pressed a fist to his chest. This chaos you've created in me. And the thought of losing you? His voice cracked. It scares me more than losing everything else. Emma stepped forward, her hand hovering near his arm, but not quite touching. Alexander, I'm not Catherine. I'm not going to walk away because it's easier, or because someone richer waves their name around. I'm here because I choose you, the man, not the empire. For a moment, neither spoke. The city hummed beyond the glass. But in the room, there was only the sound of two hearts breaking and mending at the same time. Finally, Alexander exhaled, as though releasing years of tightly held breath. Do you know what I saw tonight? His voice softened. You, standing in front of them all. Fearless, defiant. Not because of what you could gain, but because of what you might lose. You fought for me. Emma, no one has ever done that. Her throat tightened. Maybe no one thought you were worth fighting for. He stepped closer, closing the last of the distance. And you do, I always did. Something shifted in his eyes then. The fear, the doubt. The iron wall's cracks widened, letting something warmer, something truer shine through. I love you, he said, the words almost foreign on his tongue. He repeated them, stronger this time. I love you, Emma Caldwell, and I am done being afraid. Her breath caught, her vision blurred with tears. She had dreamed of these words, feared she might never hear them, and now, here they were, raw and unpolished, the truest thing he had ever spoken. She lifted a trembling hand to his face, her thumb brushing against the sharp line of his jaw. Say it again. His hand covered hers, grounding them both. I love you, not the idea of you, not the role you play in my life, just you, the woman who challenges me, infuriates me, makes me laugh when I don't want to, makes me human when I'd rather be stone. You. Emma's tears slipped free, but her smile was radiant. Good. Because I love you too, even when you're impossible, especially then. He pulled her into his arms then, not with the dominance of a man used to possession, but with the desperation of someone who had nearly lost everything. His lips found hers soft, searching, a confession written in touch rather than words. For once, Alexander Harrington wasn't the predator, the strategist, the untouchable king of steel and glass. He was just a man, broken open, held together by the woman who refused to let him collapse. When they finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against hers, their breaths mingling in the quiet. So what happens now, she whispered. Now. He smiled faintly, a smile that reached his eyes. Now. We stop pretending to be stronger apart. Now we fight together. Emma nodded, her heart steady for the first time in weeks. Whatever battles lay ahead. Catherine, the board, The press, they would face them side by side, and that changed everything. Later that night, when Alexander finally allowed himself to sleep, Emma lay awake beside him. She studied the man who had once seemed untouchable, now vulnerable in the soft glow of the city lights. She thought of his words, his fear, his confession, and she realized something. Love wasn't about tearing down walls. It was about choosing, every day, to walk through fire together. And for him, she would walk through flames. Autumn had settled over New York, painting the city in shades of amber and gold. Emma loved this time of year, the crisp air, the crunch of leaves beneath her shoes, the way even Manhattan seemed to soften under the glow of late afternoon sun. But today, her heart thumped for reasons that had nothing to do with seasons. She had a plan. For weeks. Emma had quietly coordinated with Helena, who seemed far too delighted to conspire. Tonight, at the very restaurant where she and Alexander had shared their first quiet dinner, not as boss and assistant, but as two people stumbling into something real, Emma would propose. She had the ring, simple but elegant, chosen with care. She had the words she wanted to say, rehearsed 100 times, and she had the conviction that this was right. She didn't want Alexander to think love had made her passive, or that she was simply waiting for him to decide their future. She wanted to stand beside him, not behind him. That evening, as she dressed, her hands shook with nerves. A navy dress, understated jewelry, hair swept back in a way that made her feel like herself. When Alexander arrived to pick her up, he looked devastatingly sharp in a tailored suit, though his crooked smile softened the effect. "You look beautiful," he said, kissing her cheek. "And you look smug," she teased, though her heart fluttered, just confident. His green eyes sparkled with something secret. Emma tucked her small velvet box into her purse, completely unaware that Alexander had slipped something of his own into his jacket pocket. The dinner was perfect. Candlelight flickered across polished glasses. Laughter and low music filled the air. They ordered the same dishes they had before, reminiscing about that awkward evening that now seemed like a lifetime ago. Emma waited until dessert, her palms slick with sweat. She reached for her purse only to freeze when Alexander cleared his throat. "There's something I want to say," he began, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. Emma blinked. "Oh, yes." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small box. Her heart stopped. "No, no, no, no. He's not Emma Caldwell," he said, opening the box to reveal a stunning emerald-cut diamond that caught the candlelight like fire. "You turn my life upside down. You challenge me. You saw me. You refuse to let me hide. I can't imagine my future without you. Will you marry me?" The restaurant erupted in gasps and murmurs. Emma's jaw dropped, her hand still halfway inside her purse where her own box sat hidden. For a moment, she simply stared at him. Then laughter bubbled up, half hysterical, half joyful. "Alexander," she whispered, tears pricking her eyes, "you unbelievable man. I was going to propose to you tonight." His brows shot up. "You were what?" She pulled her own velvet box from her purse and placed it on the table. His eyes widened, then softened into the kind of smile that melted her. "Of course you were," he said with a chuckle. "Because of course you wouldn't just wait for me." Emma opened her box to reveal a platinum band, simple and strong, engraved inside with the words, "You are worth fighting for." The table beside them erupted in applause. "I guess the question is," she said, her voice trembling, "do you want to say yes first, or should I?" Alexander stood, pulling her to her feet. "We'll say it together." They both laughed, voices overlapping as they said in unison, "Yes." The restaurant clapped, a few strangers even wiping away tears. The next day, Alexander was quiet, contemplative, but his eyes gleamed with mischief. That evening, he took Emma by the hand and led her to Central Park. The gazebo, where they had once argued, once confessed truths they hadn't meant to speak aloud, was now strung with fairy lights. White roses lined the steps, and a violinist played softly in the corner. Emma's heart clenched. "Alexander, what is this? This, he said, guiding her inside, is my turn. But you already proposed last night was an ambush. He smiled, that rare, boyish smile. This is the one I planned. He dropped to one knee, taking her hand. Emma Caldwell, you walked into my life when I thought I was beyond saving. You reminded me that love isn't weakness, it's the only strength worth having. You fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself. I don't deserve you, but I swear I'll spend the rest of my life trying. Will you marry me again? Emma laughed through her tears. Twice in 2 days? You're ridiculous. Persistent, he corrected. She dropped to her knees too, pulling him into a kiss before whispering, yes, 1,000 times. Yes. They stayed in the gazebo long after the violinist left, wrapped in each other's arms, the city humming quietly around them. 2 proposals in 2 days. 2 stubborn hearts, equally determined to prove their love. And Emma realized this was exactly how their life would be: chaotic, surprising, sometimes absurd, but always together. The Harrington estate sat on the northern edge of Connecticut, a sprawling Georgian mansion framed by rolling lawns and centuries-old oak trees. It was the kind of place Emma had only ever seen in glossy magazines, too polished, too perfect, too intimidating to feel real. Alexander drove them himself, unusually quiet at the wheel. His jaw was tight, his hands firm on the leather steering wheel. Emma glanced at him, her stomach fluttering with nerves. You look like you're preparing for battle, she said lightly. He gave a humorless smile. In a way, I am. My mother doesn't welcome change easily. Emma smoothed her skirt, wishing it didn't look so plain against the luxury that awaited. She doesn't know me. Maybe she'll surprise you. Alexander shook his head. She's Eleanor Harrington. She never surprises anyone. She is the surprise. Eleanor Harrington greeted them in the grand foyer, her presence as commanding as the marble staircase behind her. She was in her early 60s, but carried herself with the elegance of a queen. Her silver hair was styled immaculately, her pearl necklace gleamed, and her sharp blue eyes assessed Emma in a single sweep. So, Margaret said, her voice cool and precise, this is the woman I've been reading about in every gossip column. Emma flushed but extended her hand. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Harrington. Margaret's handshake was firm, almost a test. We'll see if the pleasure is mutual. Alexander bristled. Mother? She raised a hand, silencing him. Dinner first, then we'll talk. The dining room was as intimidating as its mistress. A chandelier glittered overhead. A long mahogany table stretched between them, and the walls were lined with stern family portraits. Margaret sat at the head, Alexander on her right, Emma on her left. The meal was exquisite roast duck, asparagus with truffle butter, wines Emma couldn't pronounce, but the atmosphere was anything but comfortable. Margaret asked questions, each one sharpened like a blade. What is your educational background? Miss Caldwell. Emma swallowed. I studied business administration at night classes while working full-time. Margaret's brows arched. Not Ivy League. Then, no, Emma said evenly. But every class I paid for myself. Every grade I earned. Margaret's lips pursed, but her eyes flickered with the faintest trace of respect. Next question. And your family? My mother raised me alone. She worked as a waitress most of her life. She taught me everything I know about resilience. Margaret's gaze sharpened. So, no wealth, no pedigree, no connections. Alexander slammed his fork down. Enough. Emma doesn't need to justify herself to you. Emma touched his arm gently. It's okay. Then, turning back to Margaret, she said calmly, You're right. I don't come from money. But I know what it means to fight for everything I have. I know how to stand on my own. And I love your son not because of what he owns, but because of who he is when the world isn't watching. The room fell silent. Alexander's chest swelled with pride, but he said nothing, letting Emma's words hang. For the rest of dinner, Margaret said little. She studied Emma with the calculating eye of a woman used to reading people like open books. Emma forced herself not to shrink under the scrutiny. Finally, when dessert arrived, a delicate crème brûlée, Margaret set down her spoon. "You're stronger than you look." Emma blinked. "Thank you. I think—" Margaret's lips curved, the faintest smile breaking through her stern facade. "That wasn't meant as an insult. Many have sat at this table, women eager to please, women who thought charm alone could earn their place. You, however, bring fire. That will be necessary if you are to survive in this family." Emma's heart leapt. "Does that mean you approve?" Margaret lifted her glass. "It means you haven't disappointed me yet. Which, believe me, is rare." Later, as they prepared to leave, Margaret pulled Emma aside in the grand hallway. Her voice was low, stripped of the icy veneer. "My son has suffered more than he admits. Catherine wounded him deeply, and I feared he would never trust again. But tonight, I saw something I haven't seen in years. Hope. If you are the reason for that, then you are welcome here." Emma's throat tightened. "I promise I'll protect him." Margaret's eyes softened. "Then perhaps you are exactly what he needs." In the car ride back, Alexander reached for Emma's hand, threading his fingers through hers. His usual confidence was tempered by something gentler. "You impressed her," he said quietly. "That's no small feat. She terrifies most world leaders." Emma laughed shakily. "She terrifies me too, but I think she believes me." He squeezed her hand. "I always believed you," and for the first time, Emma felt she truly belonged not just at Alexander's side, but within the Harrington family itself. The engagement party had been a glittering affair. Laughter, champagne, a sea of friends and business allies offering their congratulations. But when the last glass was emptied and the last guest had gone home, what remained wasn't the sparkle of diamonds or the glamour of society. It was a quiet truth: Emma and Alexander weren't just building a marriage. They were building a life. It started with a conversation at their kitchen table. The morning after the party, the Harrington penthouse still carried the scent of roses and candle wax. Emma sat cross-legged in her chair, hair loose, sipping coffee from a mug that didn't match anything in Alexander's pristine set. "Do you ever think," she asked softly, "about the kids who will never even get close to this kind of life, who never get a chance? No matter how hard they work." Alexander set down his newspaper. "All the time. I was one of them once." Emma tilted her head. "Not exactly. I didn't inherit Harrington Enterprises," he said, a shadow passing through his gray eyes. "But I inherited opportunity. My father built doors, and all I had to do was walk through them. That's a luxury most never have." Emma thought of her mother working double shifts at the diner, of late nights spent studying with aching eyes. Exactly. Some of us never saw doors, only walls. She hesitated, then reached across the table. What if we built doors for them, that afternoon? Alexander called Margaret Hale into his office, along with Helena. Together, they sketched the beginnings of an idea, a scholarship fund for students from low-income families. Not just tuition, Emma insisted, her voice firm. Living expenses, mentorship, internships. Because getting into college isn't enough if you can't afford rent or groceries. Alexander studied her, a flicker of pride softening his usual steel. "You've thought about this. I've lived this." Emma replied. Helena tapped her pen thoughtfully. "It could be done, but it will take significant funding, and the board won't be thrilled if this looks like charity instead of strategy." "Then we won't call it charity," Alexander said smoothly. "We'll call it investment in the kind of leaders this company should want in 20 years. The fund launched 6 months later, the Caldwell Harrington Scholarship Initiative. The name was Emma's idea, though Alexander argued at first it should be the Harrington Foundation. He had said. Emma shook her head. "No, this isn't just about your family name. It's about partnership, about building something together. Caldwell stays." For the first time in his life, Alexander yielded not because he lost, but because he wanted to share the victory. At the press conference, cameras flashed as Emma stepped up to the podium. Her hands trembled, but her voice was steady. "I grew up in a town where dreams were a luxury," she began, "where working hard wasn't always enough. My mother taught me resilience, but even resilience needs opportunity. This fund is for the dreamers who are told they don't belong, for the fighters who are exhausted from fighting alone. It's our promise that your past does not define your future." When she finished, the room erupted in applause. Reporters clamored for quotes, but what mattered most was the quiet pride in Alexander's eyes as he watched her. The first recipients arrived that fall, teenagers with secondhand backpacks, nervous smiles, and stories that mirrored Emma's own. She met each of them personally, listening to their hopes: engineering, nursing, teaching, art. One girl, shy with wide brown eyes, whispered, "Miss Caldwell, thank you. No one's ever believed in me before." Emma knelt, squeezing her hand, then let this be the first of many times. At home that night, Alexander wrapped his arms around her as they stood by the window, city lights glowing beneath them. "You changed something today," he murmured. Emma shook her head. "We did." "No." He kissed her temple. "I've built skyscrapers, contracts, empires, but you." His voice caught, softer than she'd ever heard it. "You built hope. That's more powerful than anything I've ever signed." Her chest ached with love. "Then let's keep building. Not just for us, for them, for everyone who needs a door." Their life wasn't without challenges. The press still circled, Catherine's shadow still lingered, the board still scrutinized every move. But Emma and Alexander had found their rhythm not as CEO and assistant, not as billionaire and nobody, but as partners. When storms came, they faced them side by side. When victories came, they celebrated together. And when doubt whispered, they had each other's voices louder still. Partnership, Emma realized, wasn't about perfection. It was about choosing, every day, to share the burden and the triumph alike. And in that choice, they were unstoppable. 2 years later, the headlines had long since quieted. Catherine Ashford was a distant shadow. Harrington Enterprises had stabilized under Alexander's leadership, and the Caldwell Harrington Scholarship had grown beyond anything Emma could have imagined. But the real story wasn't in the boardroom or on magazine covers. It was in the nursery of their Manhattan apartment, where Alexander Harrington, billionaire, CEO, master of negotiations, was sitting cross-legged on the floor, scowling at an instruction manual. "This is absurd," he muttered, holding up a wooden crib rail as if it had personally offended him. "It shouldn't take an engineering degree to assemble furniture." Emma leaned against the doorway, one hand resting on her growing belly. Her auburn hair, once always pinned up for professionalism, now hung loosely around her shoulders. "You do have an engineering degree," she reminded him sweetly. 3 of them, if I recall correctly. "That's not the point." He jabbed at the manual. This diagram is nonsense. Whoever wrote it should be arrested." Emma laughed, the sound soft and full. She waddled over, lowering herself carefully beside him. Maybe the great Alexander Harrington finally found his match, a $200 crib from IKEA. He shot her a mock glare, but his lips twitched. "Don't you dare tell Helena. She'll never let me live it down." "Oh, she already knows," Emma teased. "She texted me an hour ago. Tell Alexander I'll bring my toolkit." The truth was, their life was far from the flawless perfection the tabloids once painted. Some days, Alexander came home late, exhausted and sharp-tongued, and Emma had to remind him gently that love wasn't measured in profits. Some days, Emma doubted herself, worried she wasn't enough for the world she'd married into. But more often than not, they met in the middle with apologies, with laughter, with the quiet intimacy of 2 people choosing each other again and again. That night, as they finally gave up and called Helena to rescue the crib situation, Emma found herself watching Alexander from across the room. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair mussed, his expression caught between irritation and amusement, and her heart swelled. Because beneath the power suits and the headlines, he was simply hers. The wedding, a year earlier, had been everything and nothing they expected. The flowers had arrived late, the cake collapsed during transport, and Catherine, in one last act of defiance, had attempted to make an appearance only to be escorted out by security before she even reached the reception hall. But none of that mattered. Not when Emma walked down the aisle in her grandmother's lace dress. And Alexander's eyes filled with tears he didn't bother to hide. They said their vows not as CEO and assistant, not as billionaire and mystery woman, but as two people who had fought their way through storms and chosen love anyway. And when they kissed, it wasn't polished for the cameras. It was messy, tender, and utterly theirs. Now, on a quiet Sunday morning, Emma sat curled on the couch with a book, while Alexander wrestled with the crib pieces on the nursery floor. Sunlight filtered through the windows, painting the walls golden. "Do you ever miss it?" Emma asked suddenly. "Miss what?" "The chase, the spotlight, the drama of it all." Alexander paused, looking up at her. His expression softened, and for a moment she glimpsed the man she'd first met, ruthless, untouchable, a storm in human form. Then he smiled, small and real. "No, I don't miss it. Because this." He gestured around the apartment, at her, at the mess of wood and screws. "This is everything I didn't know I wanted." Emma's eyes stung. She set her book aside and joined him on the floor, resting her head on his shoulder. "Imperfect," she murmured. "Infuriating," he added. "And still," she finished, "exactly right." That night, as they finally stood over the finished crib assembled only with Helena's timely intervention, Alexander slipped his hand into Emma's. "Happiness isn't perfection," he said quietly, echoing a thought that had been forming between them for months. Emma squeezed his fingers. "It's choosing each other, every single day." And as their unborn child kicked gently beneath her hand, they both knew they had already found their ever after, not flawless, not without struggle, but real. And real was better than perfect, at its heart. This story is not just about a woman and a man finding love in unlikely places. It is about what it means to endure, to open oneself to trust again, and to build something lasting from broken pieces. Emma teaches us that resilience often comes from the humblest beginnings. She carried scars of poverty and doubt, yet she chose to face each day with quiet determination. Alexander, with all his wealth and power, teaches us another truth: even the strongest among us can be prisoners of fear, and it takes courage, not control, to love fully. For those of us later in life, perhaps the lesson is this: happiness isn't about perfection or about avoiding mistakes. It's about showing up again and again for the people we love. It's about building doors of opportunity for others, even when the world only shows walls. And most of all, it's about recognizing that we are never too old, too wounded, or too late to choose connection over isolation. Because in the end, what remains isn't the empire we build, but the relationships we nurture, the kindness we give, and the love we dare to protect. Thank you so much for spending your time with us and for letting this story into your heart. If Emma and Alexander's journey moved you, inspired you, or simply kept you company today, we'd be grateful if you could support our channel. Please remember to like this video, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story we bring to life. Your support helps us continue to create meaningful tales that touch the soul. Until next time, take care and never stop believing in the power of love and resilience.